All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're gonna go ahead and get started. My name is Gonzales. I'm a co-executive director at the Catalogue for Philanthropy. Just want to say how excited we are to have so many wonderful organizations and individuals taking part in our first annual National Small Nonprofit Summit. We love having the opportunity to share these ideas and really learn from one another and hopefully help us all be more successful going forward. Today's panel, this panel is going to be focused on anti-racism and social justice and how the ongoing movement has impacted organizations and how leaders of nonprofits are dealing with those issues as they come along. We have 3 panelists joining us today, and I'll let them introduce themselves in just a moment. Before we get started, just want to say a couple of things about the format. We have a set of questions that we'll be asking our panelists and that they will have the opportunity to answer and discuss. We'll try to save some time at the end for questions for participants. If you have questions, feel free to add those to the chat. And again, when we get to the Q&A period, we'll try to address those as best we can. We're going to get started. Kim, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and tell a little bit about your organization and what you do.
Sure. Thanks for letting me be part of this. I'm Kim Jones. I'm the executive director of the Nonprofit Village. I've been there since 2012. Before that, I had been a board member, and before that, I had been a volunteer when the organization was just getting off the ground around 2006, 7, 8. So I've kind of played different roles in the organization, but we are a regional capacity builder. We provide education resources, shared space, back office services to nonprofits. We're located in Montgomery County, although some of our members are not only working all over the region or nation, but some are working internationally. And 43 are housed with us. We train through our programs about 200 or so a year. It's been as high as 250 a year. Aaron, you're muted.
Thanks, Kim. Amanda?
Hi, my name is Amanda Katz. I'm the executive director of JCADA. We help victims of power-based violence. So that includes domestic violence and intimate partner violence, sexual assault, elder abuse, stalking, workplace harassment. And we see people in Maryland, DC, and Virginia. The organization's been around for 20 years, and I've been an executive director for about 1.5 years.
Okay, great. Thanks, Amanda. And Jeff?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Tribble. I'm the executive director of the MusicianShip. We are 11 years old. We facilitate music lessons, experiences, and opportunities to benefit youth who need us most. We do that primarily through after-school programs, summer programs, masterclass programs. This year, working with about 1,600 young people. We also have some community engagement projects under our umbrella. One being the Washington Area Music Awards, affectionately referred to as the Whammies. It's a 32-year-old music awards show that celebrates and honors DC area musicians. We actually acquired it from the Washington Area Music Association in 2018. And then after some well-documented funding woes, we acquired the DC Funk Parade, which is a 70,000 person parade and music festival that happens on U Street each year in DC. But all of it is about bringing attention and awareness and funds to support our free of charge music programs for young people.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it. And thank you all again for agreeing to be a part of this panel and taking part in this discussion. Kind of kick us off, I would ask you to share a little bit about, in general, what your organization has done in response to the Black Lives Matter movement and the protest and social justice movement that's been going on. I don't know, Kim, if you want to go ahead and get started.
Sure. So we didn't do a whole lot immediately because of what happened with the murder of George Floyd. Our work around equity and inclusion and social justice really started a little over 1 year ago. And it was a result of some conversations we were having internally and some conversations we had with our board at a retreat where we had some areas of success looking at diversity and equity in some of our day-to-day operations, but needed to look deeper at what we were doing in other areas of the operations. And then as a leader of color, I was faced with the thing that always happens is sometimes people say things, sometimes people think things, sometimes people aren't aware and don't know that I happen to be African American because they're just not aware. And some other conversations kind of take place because of that. So I ended up bringing some intentionality, I guess, to the table there and looking at what we could do better to increase awareness, look at even some of our board development, which was one of our weak areas. And it just was, I think, accelerated because of what was happening with not just the George Floyd incident, but others that had been a culmination. And as a capacity builder, I kind of had to address it in terms of, the board said, do you want to put out a statement? And I said, I really want to put out a statement about how angry I am. And part of it was about how angry, and they wanted it toned down. And I said, this is the statement, and we're just not going to do this kind of performative, oh, we stand, but what do we do that's in line with our mission? And for that reason, after a recommendation, we decided that what we would do is continue to bring awareness because we're best at bringing resources to other organizations, and we would intentionally bring those resources forward. We didn't have to be the one doing some other of the steps, but making sure we're highlighting those other things. But we ended up, putting out something that actually got some attention from some of our partners. Some of our member organizations said, thank you for starting the conversation. How do we do this now internally among each other? And it's kind of escalated from there. So it's been positive.
Well, it's great. And it's great that you've made those resources available. I think you're in a unique position to do that for your constituents there. Amanda, Jeff, is there anything you want to share on that?
I'd love to read you our statement that I put out on social media. JCADA's mission is to end power-based violence. Racism leaves people of color vulnerable to abuse and violence. We stand with victims and survivors of police brutality. We are allies, and we are here to help anyone who has suffered from power-based inequities. Essentially, power-based violence in our world is when one person has power and control over another person, and we are seeing that so much now in this police-citizen realm. And, while we're not specialists in handling police brutality issues, we did get a lot of calls from people who were looking for help with having had incidents with the police. And it was important to me that we get a better resource bank of people to go to so that we could refer people to the right place. Our top priority and core value is cultural humility. So we know that as a learning organization, we're constantly, humbly, continually pushing ourselves to learn more and more about the victims that we serve. We've had over, I think this year it was 29 different religions, people of 29 different religions identify themselves to us. We have people of every race and color, and we are always trying to learn where they're coming from so we can meet them where they are to give them the best trauma-informed care that we can. And so part of that has been training our staff and training our board. And I have been working to diversify our board since I got here a year and a half ago. And it's been a journey. We're still on this journey. We've gotten a little further along, but it's certainly something that I haven't let go. And we have created some internal channels on Team to talk about, to share information, to share resources, and sort of internally have this conversation. It's brought about a lot of strong connections within the staff community as well.
Oh, that's great. I like that term, cultural humility. That's I really like that. You both mentioned the statements there that you've released in response to the movement. I wonder, Jeff, have you, as your organization, released a statement, and if so, what has been the reaction to that, both from staff, board members, donors, and any other stakeholders of your organization?
Yeah, so we did release a statement, and this may or may not be germane to most people's work, and by extension, they may or may not have heard of this, but Blackout Tuesday was a day on which the music industry sort of coalesced with one another to say the show must stop or the show must be paused. And it was a day on which individuals around the nation and within the music industry particularly were wanting to pay special attention to their Black staff, to their mental health, and to all of the Black individuals who work within the music industry. And of course, there are a lot, you know, and so we did put out a Blackout Tuesday message. I shared with the co-panelists and you, Aaron, before the call that I was actually on paternity leave just 3 weeks ago when Blackout Tuesday took place. And my white director of youth programs called me as though it were the worst thing in the world. And she said, Jeff, we have to put out a statement. We have to put out a statement. And I really appreciated the fact that she came to me and she said that, knowing that at that point, it was probably my second day of leave. So really trying to just spend time with our new son. Mm-hmm. And so I pulled together a message. I ran it past our director of youth programs, Amber, who suggested that we put it out, as well as our communications manager. And it was received very well for the most part. I think the parts that made people uncomfortable were the parts where we talked about the riots. We didn't speak in support of the riots, but I think that America has somewhat of a revisionist history when it comes to rioting and protesting. For example, the Tulsa, Oklahoma riots. It wasn't something that I learned about in elementary school or middle school or in high school, but an entire community of maybe 300 something odd Black people were killed, in addition to $36 million in damage being done. And so we, you know, outraged about the looting that's happening now, but there was looting that happened then too in 1921. And in addition to the looting, there were actual murders. And another riot that happened, we celebrate. It's called the Boston Tea Party, where, you know, $1 million in tea was dumped into the ocean, where white people dressed up as Indians. And so, you know, we can't look at the riots and take it and let it detract from the greater messaging. And so I think when I mentioned that, there were some people, including one board member, who felt as though I crossed the line. But for the most part, it was well received. And again, you know, the two people who vetted it were, you know, our director of youth programs, who is not a person of color, as is our communications manager. She's not of color either. And so we were really fortunate to have allies on our staff who could band with myself alongside our other persons of color within our organization to get out that message.
Right, and you make a good point too. It's definitely something I've seen that in terms of revisionist history, where people automatically start saying that if something is unlawful or there's criminal acts involved, somehow it negates the message or their position. Right. But I think people often forget, as you mentioned, that, you know, there have been pretty much any instance of significant change in our history has been the result of some sort of illegal protest, or that something that involved, like, it wasn't necessarily always violent, but there was definitely you know, civil disobedience involved. So I think, you know, that's a good point, and definitely something I see a lot, quite a bit. How about any feedback or response you've gotten from donors to the message you're putting out? Has there been any positive, negative feedback, or any kind of response from that group? And I open it up to anybody.
We actually didn't have any individual. Well, we have very few individual donors. It's mostly institutional donors. And I think we had one or two that responded and called and said, can you help us? We now, you know, have some questions about what more we could do. Or one called and said, we're just at a loss. We have an employee that wants to, feels it's important to state something about the organization's position, but it's a lower level employee. And I said, well, isn't that the point, that you would include and engage every person at every level? What's the problem with taking that administrative person and partnering them with your board or board member who they probably rarely get access to, and having their voice speak in terms of creating whatever your organization's statement or policies or action plans will be. And the person it was kind of like enlightenment or something. Oh, well, we just thought senior staff, do that. And I said, but that's the whole point of diversity, equity, inclusion, is that you're bringing this inclusion and you're empowering people at every level. So other than that, we just didn't have a lot of response from donors. It was more from partner organizations and from member organizations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. And I was curious because we had a similar experience. We put out a statement as well with the Catalogue, and weren't given our donor base and the diversity amongst it, we weren't sure what the response would be. And we didn't get a ton of response, but the response we did get was positive, and in some cases asking how we can get involved and help with the work that we're doing. Speaking of talking about statements, and one question that we've gotten quite a bit is how do we make sure that the statements and the words we're putting out aren't just performative activism? How do we make sure we're showing up and doing the important work and actually putting these statements into actual action that can have an impact and effect on the changes that we were trying to affect through this movement right now?
I'll just, I'd love to talk about partnerships and how powerful it is when you have engaged with another organization in a really authentic way to become allies for each other. And we have started to use the word accomplice also. If you're reading some of the articles that are coming out now about systemic change, an ally can stand with you and an accomplice will go and try to work to break down the structure that is causing the issue. So we had a client who had been strangled by her abuser and was in the hospital, and we were able to be in the hospital with her as an ally. But when the hospital broke HIPAA protocol and gave her location to her abuser, now we had to become accomplices and meet with the forensic nurses and that hospital to make sure that those systems were solidified and in place that failed her. So if you apply that sort of work that we're doing every day to this, with a social justice lens, to the racial piece of this, it's us, our legal name of our entity is the Jewish Coalition Against Domestic Abuse, and we were founded as a Jewish organization to help Jewish women, 20 years ago, who were suffering from domestic abuse in their homes. And the organization has always kept that, fundamental mission, but we've grown to help anyone and everyone who needs us. And that's really happened through just all these partnerships and trust building with every organization that also may have been founded, say for the African American community, for the Island Asian and Island Pacific community. We have there are a lot of marginalized groups that have formed their own entities to help. But when you look at the numbers in DC, nationally, 1 in 3 women are going to experience domestic violence, but in DC it's 1 in 2. And the racial makeup in that case is heavily African American. And so we know that when we are we have to keep on our toes about this issue to help the community in every way, shape, and form. And that can be, extraordinarily severe here in the DC area.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I would say it sort of depends on what the nature of your work is. Work having to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion is largely an extension of our work. And so a lot of it is in our case about doubling down on ameliorating inequalities as it relates to education, more specifically music education. But, for other people where race isn't necessarily a part of your work, it could be ensuring that, staff who are of color feel comfortable working alongside you in your joint effort towards achieving your mission. It might, I don't know if anyone listens to NPR, but this morning, 28-year-old organization, the Sierra Club, publicly denounced, the racism of its founder. And so it might be taking a look at your organization's history and sort of disentangling some of what it was founded upon, or at the very least, maybe even doing some training for your staff. I think are things that you can do.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say I agree with what both Amanda and Jeffrey are saying. And this morning also, I think NASA decided that they're going to rename their headquarters building, which has never been named after a person. Other buildings around the country have. And my husband happens to work for NASA, and he said, "Oh, it's they're going to name the building after Mary Jackson, one of the Hidden Figures, experts." And I said, "How does that make change?" So when Aaron, when you were asking about performative activism, I said, but how does that make change that they've renamed a building? Is there, like Jeffrey said, is there a doubling down of the work that the institution is going to do in terms of more actively recruiting and retaining and elevating people of color into leadership positions and promotions, and without using this whole old quota system? And it's one of the things that we had to explain to a few of our board members. I had a situation just last year with a person that I'll call Miss Equity on our board that said, "I just don't understand why we have to divvy up the pie anymore for you people." As I sat there, and two other people of color on the board sat there, so it became a discussion about, is this part of our core values? Does this issue need to be addressed in renaming what our values are, our vision is? Do we need a committee? Do we elevate this in our bylaws? Some of the board members thought, oh, if you do a DEI committee, shouldn't it just fall under some other committee? And most of us knew that you have to make it that imperative. That's the real activism, and you have to elevate that issue just like you would anything else in your strategic plan, using that equity lens that Amanda was talking about in all of the work that you do. But you have to treat it as that imperative that you would if you were looking at developing a fundraising plan or strategy. So it has to have that same importance.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I have a question from one of our participants that actually is directly related to something you, Kim, and Jeff were talking about. And it's how have you handled board members who don't agree with or understand your stance and work related to social justice, whether it's a statement or just your overall approach to it? How have you kind of handled those conflicts or disagreements with board members who've raised issues?
For me, it was, go ahead, Kim.
No, go ahead.
For me, it was very difficult. because this is a person who, so I'm one of the founders of the organization. This is a person who was a founding board member, someone who I consider to be a real friend and mentor, and is a good-natured human being. But in retrospect, when I got his note back in response to mine, I said to myself, we've never talked about race. And so I think, for a lot of people, there is just a fundamental misunderstanding of the challenges that we as a nation face, what people of color face. And so my response was a long email that matched his in length. And I, line by line, as politely as I possibly could, deconstructed every single thing that he said to me. And I let him know that as uncomfortable as he was, reading my email, I was as uncomfortable having to write it. I was uncomfortable having to respond to his. I let him know that the challenges that, he and I have in this world as different hued human beings are not the same. And I just, it was just me opening up and being honest. So that's how I approached it.
And how's what was the response, and how's the relationship been since that conversation?
Great question. So we actually haven't talked about it since, despite my efforts to do so. And I think for him, without knowing for sure, I think he would prefer to just avoid the conversation and kind of sweep it under the rug. And we have since had conversations about business, which have gone perfectly fine, board meetings, but then of course, individual conversations that he and I have both had about family, about, it's almost as though his approach is just to leave it alone. And, the one thing I would say is that, there is a real delineation now at this point in time between, considering yourself a person that is not a racist and versus a person who is anti-racist, which is what we're here to talk about, right? And so I would think that he would probably consider himself to be the former, at least I would. And so, Aaron, we haven't talked about it actually, which is disappointing.
Yeah, that is disappointing. But I think at the very least, I think it was good that you were able to have the, as uncomfortable as you say it was for you to write that email, I think it was important for that message to be sent and for that conversation to be had.
Sometimes we talk a lot about microaggressions. And sometimes you're looking for kind of the micro growth in a person, and that's something that I see often. And Jeff's description of how a person can be uncomfortable, with whatever, I had to say to somebody, "You're probably not uncomfortable enough." But I was lucky that I had other board members specifically that and we have a very diverse board. 50% of our board is Black, Hispanic, Asian, LGBTQ, different, all of these other demographics and everything, skill sets and all. And it was something that we intentionally worked towards, over the past 3 years. And every year kind of benchmark ourselves, and we've gotten, a good mix. But I was really lucky that there were people on the board that really kind of took that on. And when one or two people were making statements and saying, "Well, I'm uncomfortable with all this, and I don't know that we need to do this," one person took a guy golfing, and he said for 5 hours he just hammered this guy, on the golf course about the importance of white voices also speaking up and taking this work on. We we have had some conversations. We tried to do it in a safe space, kind of in somebody's clubhouse, not a person's home, not an office or anything, off hours. We had a series of discussions. We built everything into ongoing generative dialogue at every board meeting. And we only meet 5 times a year, but every board meeting over the past year. And again, I was lucky that there were people that led the charge on the board that said, we need a policy statement, and they started working on it probably a year ago. It's up on our website, and just by chance, they were cleaning everything up, kind of wordsmithing it at the same time that the Black Lives Matter movement regained so much more momentum after the George Floyd murder. And it looked like they might have thrown something together, but they actually had been working on it for, I know it's been probably a year, 9 months at least. So I was lucky in that way.
No, it's great to hear.
Let me just add to that quickly. It was helpful that my board chairman backed me. As soon as our Black Tuesday message went out, he actually sent out a message, not having seen it. He sent it to me and said, Jeff, I really appreciated this. Thanks for sending. So that helped a lot too.
That's good. Yeah, it's great you both had that support from others on the board. And actually, one more thing about boards before I move on to another topic, but we had a question came for you. You mentioned you had a very diverse board, and I think it's something that many of us struggle with is gaining diversity on our boards. Has your board composition always been that way, or is there a concerted effort to create that diversity, and how did you go about doing it?
Yeah, so I was the first and only person of color on the board at the time, and it stayed that way until 2016. So we were founded in 2006, and the board, except for me, had no other diversity, and at one point had no women on the board, from what I understand, until 2015. And that's when I said, this just has to change. This just doesn't make any sense. There are people out in our community that can contribute greatly. And one person said once before to me, well, you know what? I only know white people. And I said, well, then let me introduce you to some others. And other people on the board did the same thing. And one person from the board said, I guess 2 years ago, this is really easy. This doesn't have to be hard in terms of bringing candidates forward. If you're going to recommend a prospect that is white, you also have to recommend a prospect who is a person of color or meets this other demographic. And that gave people pause when they started to think about who was in their network. And it enlightened some board members that, gee, my network itself isn't even that diverse. And the younger white members of the board or directors on the board actually drove that discussion because they grew up, especially those that are under 40 and even those that are under 30, really grew up, especially in this area, in much more of a diverse environment. And they were the ones that said, this isn't hard. This really isn't. So we had to bring out some tactics, and we've put some very specific things in place in terms of how we prospect and invite people. But we're also lucky in that we've always had the practice of inviting people onto committees that aren't sitting on the board, and therefore you get much more opportunity to even see if people fit, with your culture. And that just needs to be more people of color. And that's where we started to build and recruit.
I just wanted to add about diversity. We did an internal audit, and I'm sure everyone's seen these, where you look at age and race and religion and skills and all the different aspects of people's lives they bring to their board service. And, for us, it was very obvious where we had holes, and we've started to try to work on that. But to me, it's how does the board reflect our clients? And so the clients are our number one priority at all times. How are their needs being met to the best of our ability? And if our board doesn't fully and intimately understand their experience, they're not going to be the kind of ambassadors for our agency that we need out into the world. So I just really quick this morning at 7:30, I was on a meeting of a council to end domestic violence. I won't say which county in the DC area. And it's, 80 women of color, all different, those of us who are working in these small nonprofit agencies, and like a handful of white men. And a white man is the chair, and 2 white men are running to be the chair next. And we actually passed a motion to stop the vote and give it 3 months to look at the bylaws and make sure that there were women and women of color who would have the opportunity to be groomed into leadership roles. And I think because of this moment, we had the opportunity and the language around stopping the process of power continually residing with the same people over and over. So I think it's, I hope everyone takes those moments to really stand up, and even though it's scary and vulnerable, to say, no more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a great opportunity to do that, as you say. Shifting gears a little bit, one of the things that we hear and we've actually experienced ourselves is that, engaging staff is something we need to be really focused on, and understand that this impacts people not only professionally, but also personally as well. At a high level, can you talk a little bit about how you've engaged your teams around Black Lives Matter, and how you've taken into account both the personal and professional aspects of it, and how they might want to involve themselves as well in that movement?
Yeah, so for me, it almost always starts with just us becoming more aware of our own classes of privilege. And so we regularly talk about white privilege, whether you believe it is a thing or not. Everyone has probably heard the term white privilege, but there are a lot of different types of privilege. Like, I am privileged because I am a male. I am a lot less likely for women to jeer at me, as I'm walking down the street, much to my chagrin in high school. I may have liked the attention then, but that doesn't happen to men. I think, I am also a Christian in America. If I were a Christian in the Middle East, I could be killed, right? And so I think by us all kind of having just a better understanding of our types of privilege, it makes it easy. It puts us, most of us, on similar playing fields where we can have difficult conversations about how our privilege affects people who are sort of disproportionately affected negatively. And so for us, those are the kinds of conversations that we have. I have an open door policy, and as someone with a relatively diverse staff that includes people of color and people who are not of color, we make sure to not I'd make sure at least to not sort of encroach upon their own views. We are fortunate to have people who share many of my views, at least as far as I know. But even if I didn't, I wouldn't try to change their mind. It would just be, a conversation.
How about either you, Kim or Amanda?
I would say that working with staff, so in line with the cultural humility work that we do, we bring in someone every other month from some marginalized community to train us on what that community's experience is. how they function. So traditional Muslim, Jewish, Catholic charities, LGBTQ, people who've suffered traumatic brain injury, right? We're always trying to learn what are the things that are going to, what is someone bringing into the room with them, right? How much can we understand about that? And so our staff are so in tune to understanding people's, true selves as they come into this trauma work. And when the protests were starting, we gave everybody as much time as they needed to go to be there, to report back if they were able to take photo or video and tell us about their experience. We've added more time for people to volunteer, an hour a month on us if they want to do something in any realm, but the intention was also in the racial justice realm. And we are working to make Juneteenth into a day of service as a staff together. I think opening up these conversations and letting us talk about, our own, as Jeff said, privilege and how deeply, when you have like 20 social workers and educators in a room together, you have a lot of people who are able to express how pained they are and how they come from all their own experiences and backgrounds and where their families are from. So I think a lot of it's about space, giving people space. And I think about the space I take up in the world, and I talk sometimes with Neil, who's the executive director of Men Can Stop Rape, which is an incredible organization that also does racial equity training, and we talk a lot about the space that we take up in the world and using our voices, to the positive. I can tuck I'm not wearing it today, my Jewish star necklace away and be just another white lady, or I can wear my Jewish star and say, I am Jewish, and then, my grandparents were in, concentration camps, and if I were living in Germany all those years ago, I would be in that situation. So I think everybody has their traumas that they bring with them, and everybody has their power that they take with them.
Absolutely. And actually, you both mentioned things like giving Juneteenth off and having conversations with staff. We actually tried to put together a list of different actions small nonprofits can take right now to engage staff and to give them the space and time they need. Everything from, like you mentioned, having Juneteenth off to Election Day off, or even just having dedicated time during the day to reflect and to learn and to have those conversations. Are there any other similar type of opportunities or actions that you have taken or considered taking to give people that space and to engage them in that way beyond the Juneteenth holiday and the conversations you've had directly with staff? Both, it could be dedicated time during the day at work, or it could be something along the lines of having a more flexible leave policy so people can participate in things they want to do. Have there been any other actions or things like that that you've taken as leaders of your organization?
I would add that we also gave staff off, in addition to Juneteenth, Blackout Tuesday, as that is sort of what Blackout Tuesday is all about.
Right.
With a small staff, right now, 2 full-time people, an intern, and a long-term part-time volunteer, there's not much there. We're very proud of the fact that 5 of our last 6 hires have been people of color. So for all of our professional positions, nearly all of our interns, have been overwhelmingly people of color. And so there isn't much there. In fact, I have my deputy director is white, and he pushes me a little bit sometimes to speak up more. So like Amanda said, giving people space, I think trying to help to empower them to understand that it's okay to look at, not all the same consultants, let's look for people of color that can do the same work and kind of mix it up a bit. And you don't have to just go with the same old, or the same recommendation, the same thing with the board. Just in general, I think it's a good idea to always put your people first. Everybody talks about, oh, your staff is your greatest asset. So whatever it is that they need and will help them access what they need across the board is helpful. Kind of like years ago when we did curb cuts, and it was for people in wheelchairs, but it helped the parents with strollers. So whatever you do, whether you're closing for a day, closing for a week, allowing a flexible schedule, because it's very important for a person to be engaged with an organization that they really want to make a difference with. We always do things like summer Fridays where we take time out, just take 4 hours and everybody just go do what you need to. And sometimes people have gone to do some volunteering, but, encouraging more of and right now it's lunch dialogues behind the glass, so we're doing, breakfast behind the glass or whatever. And, so just giving ourselves and our members and other people that we have these kinds of things in common with, the opportunity to dialogue. But my deputy director has had to push me a couple of times, because he knows that sometimes we have these situations where, people will call and say, oh, we're looking for a Black person that can do this. So do you have any recommendations? And he'll go, do you think they know that you're Black? And I'll say, well, I guess not. And he'll tell me, I think you need to speak up. And if you don't, I will. So, so we have that kind of relationship where he will even push me as a white man to do more and to speak up more. So I think, the empowering of everybody is important.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to take a quick minute, and we have a couple more topics we're going to address. So I want to encourage our participants, if you have other questions you want to ask our panelists, go ahead and put those in the chat now, and we'll try to cover them before we wrap up today. The next thing I want to talk about is really a question for you, Kim and Jeff. As leaders of color, and we know that there's a real gap in terms of having people of color in leadership positions at nonprofits and the nonprofit sector in general. Based on your experience and your journey, is there any advice that you would have for staff members who are people of color who are thinking about stepping into director or executive roles at a nonprofit? Just based on your experience and things that you wish you had known going in.
Jeff?
Well, going in, wow. The way that I feel now is a lot different than I felt 11 years ago. But now, I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think that oftentimes people look at Black EDs or EDs of color and automatically assume that we're operating at a deficit, or that it's more challenging for us to get funding. And some of that is real. A lot of that is real. But I do think that there's also an opportunity. For example, we are, a relatively small, $1 million arts nonprofit in the DC region, and got, maybe $50,000 in funding in 2019 from the Kennedy Center, which is a multi-$100 million institution that's about the arts in the DC region. And you have to ask yourself why. Why is it that what can we do as this small nonprofit organization that the Kennedy Center can't do themselves, right? And so I think in the nature of that partnership was about us being connected to the communities that they necessarily weren't connected to in an authentic and an organic way, and they still wanted to sort of provide these meaningful experiences in this community. I think similarly, recently, actually, I've seen a couple of different grant opportunities for arts administrators of color or EDs of color. And so, I think the easy, long talked about narrative is the one where EDs of color sort of operate at a deficit model. But I think that there are some real strengths too. And I think that in order to sort of unearth those strengths in a way where they manifest themselves in positive ways, you really just have to be authentic and tell your story, be unapologetically you, and just continue doing the work that you endeavored to do when you got started.
Mm.
I would agree. I think that, Jeff, when you said that people sometimes assume that, you start at a point of deficit because, we read the articles, we hear the data, we know, we live it, every day, that leaders of color might have less access to resources, less access to the community network. They maybe, I look at my counterparts who might have grown up in one of the communities where they know all of the people who happen to be the top executives in certain corporations because they kind of grew up with them. And so they've got that access that I didn't have, and not just because I came from Chicago as opposed to, living here. And we all know those stories about having less support or being subjected to more oversight. But I have to agree, I think you're not always in that position, and there are these opportunities as leaders of color, rising leaders of color, for you to shine. And I think that it continually seems to get better and better and better. And it's, again, going back to the micro growth that we see in people's openness and awareness and embracing new leadership and what we can bring as African American leaders or Latinx leaders or Asian leaders. But I also do try to be honest with those who I may mentor, who are coming behind me, or who ask the question about stepping into the role. Keep your excitement, as you said, Jeff, but set up your support system. So it's not just putting your armor on every day because there are going to be things that are said or done or whatever that cause you to kind of audibly gasp or even take a step back, but set up your own support system. I think that's very important, and that's something that I think almost anybody should do, whether it's women moving into new positions of leadership, people of color, people who are young moving into positions that have been traditionally held by the older generation, and make sure that you have that sense of community around you. And it was something that, even though I had experience in founding a nonprofit, managing a nonprofit, even being an executive director of a small community-based nonprofit, and then all this other, stepping into this role, I knew that I was going to need something a little bit more, and set up an informal network of other women that I didn't know that we were able to kind of support each other in terms of what we were experiencing as African American women leaders in nonprofits in the region. So I think that it's the same that we would do for almost anybody.
Yeah, and Kim, I'd ask you, and really anyone on the call, and maybe this is my ignorance surfacing, it does often. 10 years ago, I don't really see a whole lot of questions on grant applications about how diverse your board was.
Right.
And now,
right,
I'm not seeing a lot of applications who are not asking how diverse your board is. So right. I think, being, leaders of color is a good thing now. Having other leaders alongside you who are of color is a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. Like I said, we can all look to, as much as we may talk about the fact that things have to change, we also, as you talked about, you said earlier, looking at the history of everything, look at how much, has changed. And just in 10 years, 5 years, look at what's changed just in the past year. So, yeah.
Well, no, that's great. I think having that support structure is very important, and having those people who is not only there to support you, but have that shared experience, I think is invaluable. We've got about 8 minutes left. I want to see if we can jump in and get a couple questions from our participants. The first one I have is, does anyone have a formal diversity committee internally who helps lead these efforts beyond the executive director?
Sadly, we do not. What we do have, however, is a board member who works in DEI for a living. So she is very much so a part of what we do. And we've actually begun to write into our grant applications consultancy positions for people to help vet our work through that equity lens that Amanda was talking about. So while we don't have a committee right now, you know, we're actively working alongside people who have the resources, and we're trying to get them. So.
Go ahead, Amanda. Sorry.
Thank you. For us, it's been part of our the cultural humility that I've been speaking about, but we also just joined the underserved populations leadership cohort in Virginia as part of the work of the Action Alliance of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Organizations. And so there's 4 of us from all different departments in the agency who are working together. It will be a 2-year process to identify an underserved population and really find a way to get them the services that they need in the way that they need them, not the way other people think that they need them. And just there's a chat question really quickly about constituents becoming board members. We have not had a client directly become a board member, but we have self-proclaimed survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault who identify themselves as part of their board recruitment process. Like, we don't ask them directly to identify themselves. They do that on their own as part of the story of what brought them to our agency. So to answer that question, it's always extraordinarily powerful to have someone who is at the point where they're ready to tell their story. We never ask a victim to tell their story. You can very quickly re-traumatize someone. So someone who's self-identified and puts themselves in a position of power, who has lived experience, it's extraordinarily powerful, and it's what we always aim to have continually on our board. So I hope that answers for Gabrielle.
And for Nonprofit Village, so our board felt that it was important to at least have an ad hoc committee, and that's what was formed about a year ago. And then, I guess it was probably February or March, and it was kind of too late to go back and look at the whole bylaws issue. But what they said is, okay, we missed the opportunity this year, but because you have to notify the board members of any changes, their recommendation was this needs to be a standing committee, just like executive committee, finance committee, development committee, and there was discussion, I think I shared earlier, there was discussion about whether it should fall under something else. And overwhelmingly, all but 2 people, 2 of the 13 people said, no, this has to stand alone, and it has to be given the importance and the prestige, and it's a public demonstration of what we intend to be doing. Now, we just need to write what the remit is for that committee, and then it can go forward looking at the strategic goals that it sets and working across committees, working across board and staff. So there now is a formal committee, and it will go into the next revision, official revision of the bylaws as well.
No, that's great. That's great. It's going to be a standing committee, and it wasn't part of something. Almost part of another committee or subcommittee. One last question from participants before we close. Question is, have you and how have you involved your clients and in your community in the conversations and work you're doing around anti-racism?
Sounds like Amanda does a lot.
That's a great question, because I think that the way that we approach our clients with as much cultural humility as possible, and then when we do a lot of surveying of our clients. First, we have to survey how they're recovering from their trauma, so there are ways to measure that. And then there's also ways that we ask them how we're doing and how they feel about their relationship with us as their service provider. And so we always ask, do you feel that JCADA respects your financial position? Do you feel that JCADA respects your religious practice? Do you feel that we respect your gender identity? And we sort of go through multiple questions asking, to make sure that the answer is, on a scale as to the positive as possible. And we watch that really carefully. And then we are always looking at, language to make sure that people are comfortable, but also access to language and access to translators and things like that also indicate to people that we are ready, willing, and able to respect their needs from wherever they're coming. So that's how we engage with the community. And so far, our scores have been really, really good. We always try to find room for improvement. So if we're at 98%, we want to be at 100%.
Of course.
That's a great practice. That's a great practice, Amanda. I'd like to talk to you more about that because for us, again, we don't have a large staff. We do have membership. We have been asked to have some conversations with individual organizations. They've asked us to help facilitate some conversation. But we've also had more conversations with our vendors and our partners that have said one vendor in particular said, we just seem to have a problem. We've never hired a person of color, although we did hire a Chinese person that was living in Russia once. And I thought, okay, let me make some introductions for you and let you know a little bit more about, especially because of your industry. There are a lot of, people that are entry-level folks that would love the opportunity, professional folks, because you're, it's a financial services organization. And you can then cast the net wider when you're recruiting. So we have had some of our vendors and partners say, we need some help kind of identifying those outlets to go to.
Sure. Well, it's great that they've asked for help in that scenario. That's great. Unfortunately, we are out of time. This has been a great conversation. Kim, Jeff, Amanda, thank you so much for being our panelists today and for what's been a very engaging and enlightening conversation. I hope it's one that we all continue even after this session. Just as a reminder to everybody, we will have the recordings of this session and all the other sessions available on our conference website, and we'll let you know once they are available, probably within the next couple of days. But again, thank you all for taking part. We appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you in other sessions. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.